Now, what I want to discuss this week is the fact that uh, almost Purim, right? And this week is Rosh Chodesh Hadar. So I want to discuss a little bit of an Adar theme here as we get towards Purim. So we're going to do a screen share here. I sent out a link for Bruce to distribute. I don't know if he did. Okay. How's this? Do you see a source sheet? Can you see that? I need to. Anybody want to? Yeah, you can see it. Okay, good. So let's take a look at a super famous passage of the Talmud. Talmud says, Amar Rav Yehuda Berei de Rav Shmuel Bar Shilat Mishmei de Rav. Rav Yehuda said, Rav Yehuda's name, who is the son of Rav Shmuel Bar Shilat, in the name of Rav. Keshem shenichnas av mati b'simcha, kach b'shichnas adar barbim b'simcha. Just like when Av enters, we reduce in joy. So too, when Adar enters, we increase in joy. And this is a very famous observation. You probably have heard this before. You'll notice that the formulation is not when Av comes, we're sad, and when Adar comes, we're happy. It doesn't say that. It says when Av comes, we decrease in joy, and when Adar comes, we increase in joy. That's a very interesting formulation of this notion, which I don't think it's too sermonic to say that the Talmud, by using this formulation, is suggesting that always joy, just more or less. Why else formulate it like this? Increasing joy, decreasing joy, because always joy, but more or less. I remember many, many years ago that I was in Israel. I wasn't married. This is a long, long time ago. And I was a student at Hebrew University right after high school. And it was Tisha B'Av, and I saw that there was a advertisement to take a tour of the old city on Tisha B'Av. Turned out it was sponsored by Chabad. I went. This Chabad rabbi telling jokes, smiling, laughing. I thought it was a little weird. It's Tisha B'Av. And only many years later did I understand perhaps what was going on with him. His kind of not very depressed demeanor, even on Tisha B'Av. What I'd like to do is get a fundamental understanding of the significance of joy, to the extent that it's only a question of more or less, turning up the volume, turning down the volume, but never the opposite, never sad. So let's take a look. No better place to start if we're going to try to figure out the behavior of this Chabad rabbi on Tisha B'Av. That was so many years ago. Then to look at his Bible, the Tanya, and let's take a look at what it says here. It's a very interesting analysis. What is so significant about joy that the only issue is turn up the volume, turn down the volume, but always joy? So this is in chapter 26 in Tanya. He says the following: truly, this should be known as a cardinal principle, that as with a victory over a physical obstacle, such as in the case of two individuals who are wrestling with each other, each striving to throw the other, if one is lazy and sluggish, and here he doesn't mean really lazy in the sense of, like I used to be accused of, being a lazy bum, so maybe still, by my wife. So the lazy in the sense of like melancholy, right? That kind of lack of energy. If one is lazy and sluggish, he will easily be defeated and thrown by his opponent, even though he'd be stronger than the other. Exactly so is it in the conquest of one's evil nature. It is impossible to conquer with laziness and heaviness, which originate in sadness and in a heart that is dulled like a stone. but rather with alacrity, which derives from joy and from a heart that is free and cleansed from any trace of worry and sadness in the world. Let's discuss this. It's really fascinating. What's so important about being happy? So as many answers you can give to that, you could say, because it feels bad to be sad. Okay? That's sort of like a contemporary psychological approach. Feels bad. I don't want to be in that state. Or you could say that it shows a lack of appreciation for Hashem's goodness, that he put you in this world with all these beautiful gifts and you don't appreciate it, and you just see the negative side of things, always grumbling. So you could approach like that. That's not the way the Baal HaTanya approaches it. He says something pretty amazing. He says to be a good Jew requires energy, requires strength. Why? Because to be a Jew, according to the Baal HaTanya, means to observe the mitzvot. That's the bottom line, to make for God a dwelling place in this world through the observance of the mitzvot. And in order to get yourself up to do anything, you need to have energy, right? If you don't have energy, you're not going to push yourself to engage in the effort to do the mitzvot. Not only that, but to prevent yourself from doing the transgressions requires energy. That's not necessarily intuitively obvious, but if you think about it, it's true. That think about you're on a diet and you took one cookie on Shabbat at the Kiddush, and now you want to stop yourself from having another 6. That actually takes energy. It takes energy to flex your just say no muscle. I think I might have mentioned this to you before. There's a rabbi that used to live in Los Angeles that I heard him use this particular expression, that we have a just say no muscle. And in order to exercise restraint, bless you, Kenny, in order to exercise restraint, it takes flexing of the just say no muscle. But if our just say no muscle is pretty flabby because we never use it, then we're not going to be able to restrain ourselves from doing things we shouldn't do. So it requires energy to get up and go, to be able to perform the mitzvot taseh, and it requires energy to restrain ourselves from doing the things we shouldn't do. So the Baal HaTanya says that atzvut, kvedut halev, that this feeling of lethargy and heaviness, sluggishness, that correlates to depression, sadness. It's a low energy state. Whereas joy is a high energy state. So we have to constantly be in a state of joy. Now, turn up the volume, turn down the volume, but never turn it off. Because we turn it off, then we no longer have the wherewithal, the energy to be able to be good Jews. So that's the really fascinating explanation of the Baal HaTanya of why it's important to be in a steady state of joy. Again, turn up the volume, turn down the volume, but never turn it off. Fine.
Question?
Yeah.
So we're saying that the joy that you're referring to is something that's initiated from us as opposed to a metaphysical idea that joy comes to us in the month of Adar in some more metaphysical way, whether we're aware of it or not.
Yeah. So that's an interesting question. So now, certainly the simple meaning of what he's saying is that it's what we say, marbim b'simcha. We multiply in joy. That we do it, right? It's not that it's a joyous time, right? Now, it happens to be that your point, there's truth to what you're saying, because there is this Kabbalistic notion, which I've found in many, many different contexts, both in terms of holidays and also, I think I shared this with you recently, about birthdays. Did I discuss birthdays recently? Yeah, I did. That there's this notion that there is a kind of energy in the air, or it's kind of a texture of time. Time, independent of you, but time has texture. And that texture is a function of the way the world is created spiritually. And therefore, for instance, when we observe Pesach, it's not that we're remembering what happened. It's that we actually are living it, because there is a particular texture of time at that moment, which is liberation from slavery, whatever that would mean, right? There's a, and so I think I mentioned regarding birthdays. So there's, if you remember that the approach of the Sephardi poskim, the Ben Ish Chai, particularly, is that your birthday is the precise configuration of texture of time that existed at the time that you came into the world, that special energy. And so on your birthday, you're not remembering that that's the anniversary of your birth. You're actually tapping into the same energy, which then opens up all kinds of opportunities. And that's why you should use that special texture of time to your benefit. Okay, so there's
This is a little later. Today is my mother's 88th birthday, although she passed away in 2013. My brother was talking to me that we feel happier about thinking of her on her birthday today than on the Yortzeit. And I said, well, it's not really a Jewish idea. And he said I should look into that.
Yeah, so it is, according to certain opinions, it is a Jewish idea. That we saw that happens to be a dispute. But that's the basis, that's what to answer your question, this idea of, is Adar an auspicious time for happiness, and is Av an auspicious time for turning down the volume? So there is something to that, but he's not mentioning it here. Fine. Now, what I want to do is take a look at an extremely original and difficult approach towards Tachlis. Tachlis, how do you be happy? Like, okay, I'm supposed to turn up the volume, enjoy. I mean, it's Adar Aleph right now. I guess we should we should have turned up the volume a few weeks ago. But as of Friday, I think, is the Aleph Adar Bet. Turn up the volume even more. But no, come on. When's the last time you looked at my bank account? How about this health issue? How about Shalom Bayit? How about, I'm not discussing my own particular situation, but whatever. Reality is challenging, right? How do you deal with that? I want to take a look at a really provocative and cryptic passage in Rav Kook. One of the things I love about Rav Kook is that he sees things in such an original way. I sometimes feel like you're in a hot, stuffy room and you open up the window and cool air comes in the room and you can breathe at last. That's what, for me, learning Rav Kook is like. Everything's old and stuffy. And then you read Rav Kook, it's like, oof, fresh air, right? So I think you'll find this really interesting. Now, I luckily was able to find an English translation of this particular text here, and I want to just tell you about the text. So this text is called Shmona Kvatzim. I want to tell you a little bit about it. As I probably mentioned before, Rav Kook did not write very many books, but there are a lot of Rav Kook books out there. But where did they come from? So Rav Kook did most of his writing in his own personal diaries. He had these machberot, these books, and he would write whatever thoughts came to his mind. And then his students and his son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda, took these books, these diaries, and they reworked the material thematically. So, for instance, one of the most famous books of Rav Kook is Orot HaTshuva, The Lights of Repentance. Rav Kook wanted to write a book on repentance, but he wrote the first 3 chapters and it ground to a halt for whatever reason. I don't know what the reason was. He never finished it. So his son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda, went through his father's diaries, these spiritual diaries, pulled out passages that dealt with teshuvah, organized them thematically, gave each passage a heading, and that's when you buy the book and learn it, Orot HaTshuva, you're actually only reading the first 3 chapters that are Rav Kook's own thoughts in order. The rest of the book are his thoughts, but not in the order that Rav Kook had originally written them. They're just parts of these spiritual diaries scattered all over. Now, I'm going to also mention one more thing that's a little controversial. These editors of Rav Kook's thoughts from his diaries, they took a little bit of editorial license, and they changed certain words, left out certain things, usually because Rav Kook said something which was so provocative that they felt it better not say it. So there are people now who are doing a lot of research of comparing Rav Kook's published works with these spiritual diaries, and noticing some very interesting things in an attempt to better understand Rav Kook's thinking. Now, those spiritual diaries were not open to the public until a few years ago. They were kept by the family. No one had access. Very few people had access. But a few years ago, they were published. It is called Shmona Kvatzim, which means 8. Kovitz is a collection. 8 collections of his diaries. These are the unedited, straight thoughts of Rav Kook as he wrote them down in the spiritual diaries, without any editing, no changing of the order, and it's really a fascinating experience. So the reason I'm turning around is because I just want to show you. So this is the first volume of Shmona Kvatzim, and I actually just had a chavruta right before coming on the air here. I have a chavruta twice a week. We learned the Shmona Kvatzim of Rav Kook, and it's really exciting. It's a real roller coaster, and it can be also incredibly challenging. So, with that introduction, put on your seatbelts.
It's on
See
Sefaria.
what we can do with this. I'm sorry?
It's on Sefaria.
Ah, fantastic. Yeah, and now I should also mention that it's on Sefaria. Not only that, but there's a fine Jew in Efrat, whose name slips me right now. Maybe some of you knows it. He's a translator. He's quite well known. And he has been translating Shmona Kvatzim into English, and he posted on Sefaria. So that's where I
Probably
got
David Shulman.
I'm sorry?
Probably Yaakov David Shulman.
That's him. He should get credit. So Rabbi Shulman, Yaakov David Shulman, who's doing a big favor to the Jewish people in writing a very nice translation of Rav Kook. But you'll see here, even if it's in English, it's hard to know what he means. So ready? There is an evil inclination that is extremely hidden in the depths of the spirit, an envy that rots the bones, that brings weakness and darkness to every idea of light. Now, one of the big obstacles to happiness is envy, in Hebrew, kinah. I can never be happy if I'm envious, right? There's always someone who is richer, stronger, right? Smarter, whatever it is, and I'm miserable because I'm always comparing myself to that person, and I come out short and seething with resentment, anger, whatever it is. Okay, very hard to experience joy if one suffers from this yetzer hara, this evil inclination in us that makes us feel envy. Now, look at this. This evil is a strange sort of envy. So Rav Kook is saying that there's a unusual type of envy, but it's extremely hidden in the depths of the spirit. But it's insidious, rots the bones, brings weakness and darkness to every light. But this is not the envy that you normally think of. It's a strange sort of envy. What would that be? Many people do not recognize it because a number of factors prevent the mouth from speaking about it. It's so subtle that you can't articulate it, but it sleeps. It slumbers in the concealed places of the human spirit. And occasionally it emerges in various shapes, not its true shape, as is the way of all the outcomes of envy that are clothed only in a foreign garment and which always bear a foreign name. So there's something about this type of envy that it's hard to give it a name because you don't recognize it for what it is. It's disguised. Now, I hope your curiosity is aroused by now. What envy is he talking about? Well, put in your seatbelts. This strange sort of envy is envy of God. A person envies God for his infinite happiness, for his absolute perfection. Now, what? So let's talk about this. God, from a human perspective, from our Jewish perspective, is absolute perfection by definition. We have a tendency to be hard on ourselves, to be harsh with ourselves. And I have a feeling that many people that are participating in this learning are particularly victims of this tendency we have to judge ourselves rather harshly. Why? So there's a name for this in psychology. We call it perfectionism. What's perfectionism? Right? Anything less than perfection is worthless, bad. Right? We never give ourselves credit for what we do, but any falling short of perfection is somehow not good enough. And of course, the effect of perfectionism is that we have a hard time being motivated to accomplish things because the stakes are too high. Because if I don't accomplish this perfectly, then I'm a failure.
Isn't fear of failure probably more prevalent than people that think they're a perfectionist? I mean,
that's exactly the point. But it's not like you said. The fear of failure is driven by the assumption of perfectionism. Because what is failure? It's just a word. What's a failure? Right? How do you, there's no objective definition of failure.
Well, you start a job, you try a job, and then they fire you.
Guess what?
You start a course and you fail it. I mean,
that's a success. It's semantic, right? Because what did you learn from that experience? How did that influence the next stage in your life? Right? Failure is just a word. But because we have this notion of perfectionist thinking, right? All or nothing. So we are afraid of failure because anything less than perfection is failure. Now, guess what? There's only one existence in the world which is perfect. God. So Rav Kook is saying this incredibly interesting notion that perfectionism is driven by a constant comparison of ourselves with God. So anything less than perfect, and I'm always coming out short comparing myself to God, means I'm a failure. Now, Rav Kook said that people don't give it a name. People don't think about it in these terms, but if you think about it, it's really true. Because since there really is no such thing as perfection, so why am I so hard on myself? It's because in some level of my consciousness, I have this notion that there does exist something called perfection, but actually it only resides within God. And we never are enough, right? We never are good enough. We're never religious enough. We're never pious enough. We're never healthy enough. What's driving that? Some notion that there is something called enough. But guess what? Who enough is? As a matter of fact, the literal translation, Shaddai. You know that the word Shaddai means enough. Only God is Shaddai. So we are constantly comparing ourselves to this abstraction called perfection with a capital P, Shaddai, God's perfection, and therefore beat ourselves up.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
We can never be enough. We try to do as much as we can, but God forgives us because He knows we are human beings, and as such, we can't get perfection. As much as we can, that's fine.
So what you said is beautiful and it's true. And obviously you're a very healthy person psychologically. But I know that Bruce and we're constantly beating ourselves up because we never are enough. But it's a mistake, because do you realize, and we'll talk about this more later, how distorted this is, that we're comparing ourselves to God? Right? Again, it's not conscious, but it's really what's going on a spiritual level.
Yeah, but in a way that's what drives us. That's what
Yeah.
makes people accomplish things in that. I mean, if it would not be for that striving for perfection, we wouldn't be getting any place.
Excellent point. Excellent point. So I would just say the following, that almost any negative personality trait or psychological process that is self-defeating flows from something that is actually positive. And I love your point, and that is that without a sense of accomplishment, that there is some greater expression of goodness, we wouldn't drive ourselves. It's what motivates us. But do you realize that if we're not careful, it has the opposite effect, because it gets to the fear of failure, right? If I think in all or nothing terms, I'm either perfect or I'm a failure, then I actually won't strive because I'm afraid of failure. So this, by the way, is where procrastination comes from. Why do people procrastinate? It's not because we're lazy. It's because when I think about accomplishing a certain goal, I'm too afraid that it's not gonna be good enough. So I'll just not do it. I call this the mañana syndrome. That's Spanish for tomorrow. Tomorrow. Why? Because I really don't want to do it because I don't think I'll do a good enough job. And that's very hurtful. I'm terrible. I'm a loser, right? So I agree. We have to have a sense of moving towards. And it drives us. You have to have that vision, but also to be aware that we're humans. We're humans. Now I want to show you something pretty interesting. Here's another book. So this book is called Eitzot V'Hadrachot. Miyusad al Michtevei Maran Bal Hakilat Yaakov. This is a really fascinating book. It's a book that was written by a Haredi psychologist, and he was dealing with Talmidei Chachamim, those were his clients, who suffered from a lot of psychological disabilities. And this psychologist would consult with, he's passed on now, the Steipler. I think I got that right, that Rav Kanievsky in Bnei Brak. And he would discuss these issues with this great Talmid Chacham, Rav Kanievsky. And then he put it together into a book. So it's a book that is amazing, dealing with all kinds of psychological maladies and asking the advice of the Steipler, how does one address this person from a Torah perspective. And one of the sections in this book is a collection of errors in thinking that drive people crazy. And this particular section of the book is called Ta'uyot Shchichot, common mistakes in thinking. Let me give you just a taste of this. Liot ne'ahav mikol, to be loved by everybody. You know, there are people, they're called people pleasers. They need to be loved by everybody. They need to have their self-worth validated externally by everybody else. And if someone doesn't smile at them one time, they're devastated. Their whole day's ruined. So that's a thinking mistake. And that's the first issue in this particular section of the book that Rav Kanievsky tries to dispel this assumption and this type of thinking from a Torah perspective. Next section, Liot mushlam b'chol minei ma'alot, to be perfect in all things. Guess what that is? Perfectionism. That if I'm not a big enough Talmid Chacham, I'm not the best davener in the world, I get distracted. I have fights with my wife, whatever it may be. I'm not the Chafetz Chaim. I'm not the Chazon Ish. I'm not Rav Kook. I'm a loser. Right? This is the second error in thinking that he addresses from a Torah perspective. And then he goes on. It's really amazingly interesting. He doesn't express it in the same way that Rav Kook does. Rav Kook, I think, is more of a kind of theologically, psychologically, theologically daring by saying the root is we're comparing ourselves with God because only God is perfect. So having a sense of I need to be perfect is a kind of saying that I'm comparing myself to the only thing that is the manifestation of perfection, which is God. Now,
I have a question to ask.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, I learned the Gemara the 9 times. You know, I still don't know that much about it, but I still learn, and I'm still learning now. And there's nothing we can do about it. You make as much as you can, and you do all you can, and you can't do everything. So just do as much as you can.
Beautiful. You are a psychologically healthy person, and that's why you are still, even though you're an adult, as far as I can see, and even not a young adult anymore, you still thrive and are active and radiate energy because you do not suffer, but from comparing yourself to God. Kol hakavod to you. Fantastic. Now, let's just read another.
What was the name of the sefer? Excuse me. What was the name of the sefer with the stipler?
Yeah. So this is called Eitzot v'Hadrachot. Eitzot v'Hadrachot. Amazing sefer. Now, I want to read just one more sentence here in Rav Kook. He says, this envy perverts his awareness, darkens his thought, seals up his intellect, provokes his spirit in a negative way. And when all of his means do not suffice to contain its wrath, the wrath of this jealousy, because you're not perfect, right? You're jealous of God. It ends in absolute heresy, as this person strives to remove from his pained spirit, consumed with rot, the thorn of envy that pierces him terribly. What a beautiful, nice translation. And it has that kind of poetic, lyrical quality of Rav Kook's Hebrew. What's he saying here? People don't like to be in a state of beating oneself up all the time, of saying, I'm not good enough. So what do you do about it? Well, if you're locked into this idea that subconsciously, I have to be perfect, I have to be God, right? So if you're locked into that, either you just try harder, right? you make yourself crazy, or else you say, I'm sick of this. I don't want to have imposed upon me these standards that I'm not good enough. And because it's flowing from recognition of God's perfection, and I never measure up, and I assume that God wants me to be godly incorrectly, but that's on some subconscious level, I think that. The other way of dealing with that pain of being worthless in one's own eyes is to say, I'm out of here. I'm sick of this religion, because every day I get up in the morning, I think about how inadequate I am. And I go to shul and I say tachanun and talk about what a rotten, worthless bum I am. And I'm miserable. What do I need this for? I'd like to just give it all up. And then I don't have to punish myself every day for not being good enough. And how about if I just enjoy life and lower my standards? And the only way to lower my standards is to sever my relationship with this presence of perfection that's God. And Rav Kook suggests that much of the alienation from traditional Judaism is a function of this thinking error that I have to be perfect. And therefore, we always feel sad, inadequate, worthless, self-punishing, and it results in terrible procrastination. We're not able to use our talents, etc. That's an absolutely amazing notion. Now, I want to show you how the Baal HaTanya uses the same assumption, though he does not frame it as envy of God. I think that's just such a marvelous framing of it. But it's the same assumption in terms of beating oneself up and what one does about it. Now, Rav Kook himself, in the next, these are yours, these story sheets, Rav Kook describes what to do about it. And I dare you to figure out what he means. And after you figure it out, call me up and explain it to me. It's really difficult. So we're going to put it aside. And I think I have an idea what Rav Kook means, but I want to take a look at something that's a little more down to earth. Now, along the same lines of what does one do about this sense of perfectionism in which we engage in this soul-rotting, self-punishing stance. So let's take a look at a chapter in Tanya, really interesting chapter here. It's actually a whole series of chapters where after Rav Kook defined what's wrong with being sad, because low energy state, right, prevents us from having the energy to be creative and productive and do the things we should do, and to prevent ourselves from doing things we shouldn't do. So he, after defining that, he goes through and gives his own advice on how to ward off sadness, depression, etc. So I want to share with you just one small part of how he approaches this issue. Okay, it says the following. This is just one category of how we beat ourselves up. Should the sadness, however, not come from worry over sins, but from evil thoughts and desires that enter his mind, right? Let's take a Jew. In the course of the day, we have all kinds of thoughts that we're not proud of. And because we have these standards we impose upon ourselves for being angelic, being godly, whenever we have thoughts that are somehow associated with being unholy, we feel bad about it. We beat ourselves up. What should you do about that? So he says the following. I'm just skipping a few words. He should, on the contrary, be happy. Whenever you have thoughts that are seen to be very not pious thoughts in whatever area of life you choose, everybody has their own thoughts that are not so pure and holy. He says, celebrate. Celebrate it. Be happy. Why? Be happiness portion in that though they enter his mind, he averts his mind from them in order to fulfill the injunction that you seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you go astray. Okay, now, let's just talk about this. Amazing idea. He says, I'll take an example. Nobody in this learning suffers from this. Let's say it's the middle of the summer. You're on a bus in Yerushalayim, and there's some beautiful, scantily clad women. I know you can't even imagine this kind of circumstance. And imagine somebody, not you, who mind like, and then, I'm Orthodox. Like, okay, I'll kind of look at the floor. I'm such a lowlife. What kind of Jew am I? Rejoice. Why? Because guess what? You only thought about it. If you do, it's a different story, by the way. There's a way to deal with that too. You thought about it. Now, he quotes from the Shema. Lo tatu acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem Hashem zonim achareihem. Right? Don't go after your heart, their eyes, after which you go astray. Now, go astray is not asher tem zonim achareihem, that you whore after. What's that verse saying? It's saying your heart is interested in your surrounding people. Don't act on it. That's what the verse says. When it says, seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, which you go astray, it means don't let your eyes dictate your behavior. Okay. Who's that verse talking to? It's talking to people whose eyes are zonim, are whoring after something. Guess what? This verse was not addressed to the Chafetz Chaim. He didn't have that problem, I presume. But how about the rest of us? Torah is talking to us. It's talking to people whose eyes do wander. And guess what? We didn't act on it. So what do? Look how he explains it. The verse does not speak of the righteous to refer to them as going astray. It's not addressed to Chafetz Chaims of the world, God forbid, but of intermediates like him. Guess what? It's addressed to the rest of us, in whose mind do enter erotic thoughts. Ooh, that's a word, erotic. Of whether of an innocent nature and so on. When he averts his mind from them, he's fulfilling this injunction. Guess what? If you thought about it, but didn't act on it, you have now fulfilled the mitzvah of lo taturu. You fulfill the mitzvah of don't acting on it. So the Torah is saying, I know you're gonna have a tremendous drive. Don't actualize that drive. And if you don't actualize the drive, and most of the time we don't, but we still beat ourselves up for having that drive. Take this hand, Bruce. So he says, you just fulfilled a positive mitzvah. And then let's read another sentence, and I'll get to you in a second, Bruce. He says, and guess what? That mitzvah of lo tadru acharei levavchem, of not going after your eyes, you've got to give yourself tremendous credit for that, because the rabbis of blessed memory have said, he quotes from the Talmud, he who has passively abstained from committing a sin receives the reward as though he performed a mitzvah. Consequently, he should rejoice at his compliance with the injunction as when he performed an actual positive precept. See, when we do a positive mitzvah, we give ourselves credit. Ooh, I just gave $1 million to my local shul. Ooh, I just walked a blind person across the street. Ooh, I whatever. I learned Daf Yomi today. So then, whoa, good boy. Fantastic. But the Talmud says, every time we restrain ourselves from doing a prohibition, it's the same credit as if we did a positive command. We don't think of it that way. We don't frame it that way. We just think of, oh, I didn't sleep with the cantor's wife. I don't give myself a yasher koach for that. But you should, because you wanted to, but you didn't. And the Talmud says that if you restrain yourself from performing a prohibition, that's the same thing as if you had fulfilled a positive commandment. And the same yasher koach that you give yourself for doing that positive commandment is when you restrain yourself from following your whoring eyes. Rejoice, rejoice, rejoice that you had those feelings, those urges. Give yourself a big yasher koach. Well, Bruce.
Yeah, some communities of Orthodox Jews would cut out every picture from magazines and do whatever they can to never put themselves in a position so their eyes should wander in whatever direction. And other communities of Orthodox Jews say, you know what, we should just live a normal life and restrain ourselves and be as normal as possible in the world we live in. There's two different worldviews with that. And based on what you're saying now, it sounds as if it's actually a better level to be in, quote, the real world, have the challenge, confront it, and overcome it.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I actually think it's a good question. Now, obviously, there is something to be said for an environment which is not overly provocative. Okay. I can understand that. I don't think a person should watch every Netflix movie available all the time, regardless of its content. Right? We shouldn't. You're not supposed to throw obstacles consciously into your way so you can fulfill the prohibition by not doing it, and therefore give yourself a yasher koach. And as Rav Aviner says in a slightly different context, you see, these challenges, you don't have to chase them and then have victory over these challenges. They'll come to you. Right? These challenges will come to you. You don't have to run after them. Okay. However, I would say that your point is well taken in a kind of a moderate sense, and that is, what are the costs we pay or the price we pay to create an environment in which I'm maximally unprovoked? So I'm going to tell you a quick true story. I have a friend of mine whose wife was a librarian at the Hebrew University Library, the Judaica collection. And many scholars would use these manuscripts that were in old books that are in this collection. And this librarian, she was an Orthodox woman. But she told me that how offended she was that sometimes there would be certain people who would pick scholars coming to use these texts in the library. They had to talk to her because to get a book, find a book, whatever, and they would not make eye contact. Now, she's an Orthodox woman who dresses modestly, but they would not make eye contact. And she felt so insulted and debased and dehumanized by that. So there's a price to pay, right, of creating a non-provocative framework and dehumanizing and not relating to another person in a way which is respectful by averting one's eyes. I think that's one should think twice about paying that kind of price on somebody else's back by humiliating them. And furthermore, so I'm going to tell you another. Well, it's therapeutic. I'll tell you anyway. One of my big challenges, and I have very few challenges, is food. I find food enjoyable, and it's not easy for me to say no to good food. So for a while, this is a true confession, I went to Overeaters Anonymous. You've ever heard of that? It's like a 12-step group, like Alcoholics Anonymous, but with food. So I found it helpful a little bit, but I eventually left. And I'll tell you why, among other reasons. I found other ways to improve in that area. Baruch Hashem, there's been improvement. Because this, it was all women except for me. That's just a side point. They were these were women who had been on a very restrictive eating program for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. They hadn't had a cookie in 20 years. But you know how they did it? By being totally obsessed with food. I don't know if you can appreciate what I'm saying. The price that they needed to pay to be hyper vigilant, to not follow their whoring eyes after the second piece of cake, was to devote a tremendous amount of energy and time in the course of the day to prevent themselves from eating something they shouldn't eat. It required, and this is the paradox, an obsession with food to cure their obsession with food, which seemed to me unhealthy. It can't be that you have to become obsessed with the issue of eating in order to stop being obsessed with eating. And I don't know if anybody can appreciate what I just said, but there's a lot of truth to it. Okay, so that's addressing this issue of what price are we willing to pay.
But they were willing to worry about those 10 or 20 pounds that they're overweight, so much so that they didn't gain 100 pounds.
Yeah. So then the question becomes, right, what price? Right? Or, to put it a different way, is there a path that doesn't involve obsession in order to cure an obsession? So now, and we can argue about that. And if those of you familiar with the Rambam Shmona Prakim, he does seem to suggest sometimes you become radically obsessed with the opposite behavior in order to cure some negative and self-destructive behavior. So there is something to be said about that. But I want to see one more idea before we have to close up for today.
If you walk the path for 30 to 60 minutes every day, that helps that other path.
That's certainly true. Now, I want to show you now something amazing, and you'll see how this is a wonderful approach towards not being envious of God and not suffering from the self-flagellation involved in perfectionism, which is this jealousy of God. Now, look what he says here is amazing. Do you realize that when we beat ourselves up, even though it hurts, on some level, we think that that is actually an act of piety? If the more I feel bad when I say tachanun, because I'm such a lowlife, so that itself is a proof of my piety, my godliness, because look how much I'm punishing myself because I'm not living up to the standards of perfection. So the self-punishment is itself a kind of expression of my piety, that I have these standards. Watch this. Right? So we just talked about that you should be happy that you had these thoughts but didn't act on it. Now he says, on the contrary, such sadness is due to conceit. See, we think it's piety to beat ourselves up. The sadder I am, the more pious I am. He says it's conceit, in that he does not recognize his position. Hence, he is sad at heart because he has not attained the rank of a tzaddik. Inasmuch as the tzaddik is certainly not troubled by such foolish thoughts. For had this person recognized his station, that he's very far from the rank of a tzaddik, and would that he'd be just a Benoni. You know what? Mediocrity is pretty good too. Mediocrity is good. Be brave enough to be mediocre, because that's what Hashem expects of us, to be mediocre. Now, Benoni doesn't really mean mediocre, and we don't have the time to discuss what it means. I'm using that just to wake you up. But not to have standards of expectation of one's own purity that only God has, or a tzaddik. We're not tzaddikim, we're not angels, and we are not God. Let me just finish the paragraph and then we'll open up for any comments or questions. Surely this is the quality of the intermediates in their service, to subdue the evil impulse and thought rising from the heart to the brain, and to completely avert the mind therefrom, thrusting the temptation away with both hands, as explained earlier. So he's saying, you know what your job is? Your job is to experience the temptation and not act on it. That's our job. So every time you have that temptation and you don't act on it, you say Yashar to yourself, and you rejoice in the fact that you had the temptation but didn't act on it. Because guess what? Having that temptation is not a reflection of lack of piety. It's a recognition that God made us flesh and blood. You want to get angry at God for making you this way? That's what Rav Kook talked about. At a certain point, you get so angry at God for making you feel bad about yourself that you decide to leave a relationship with God. But God made us who we are. Our job is not to be angels. Our job is to make right behavioral decisions. And then he quotes from the Zohar, and this will end, and I'll take any comments or questions. And with every thrust we are with, he expels it from his mind. The Sitra Achra down below is suppressed. And since the stimulus from below causes stimulus from above, the Sitra Achra, which above soars like an eagle, is also suppressed. And this just the last part, I'll just explain this in a second. He says that the Zohar extols the great satisfaction before him, blessed be he, when the Sitra Achra is subdued here below. For then the glory of the Holy and Blessed be he rises above all, more than by any other praise, and this ascent is greater than all else, and so forth. Just to explain it very briefly, he's saying, you think that God expects us to be like an angel. That's what we think. It's wrong. You know what gives God the greatest satisfaction, the biggest nachas, the biggest praise we could possibly have, is when we have thoughts, impulses to do something bad, and we don't act on it. That is the greatest possible praise of God. God is not praised by an angelic person acting like an angel. God is praised and has nachas from being human, very human, but making behaviorally good choices. And we have wrong expectations. When we think we have to act in a godly way, we destroy ourselves, make ourselves bitter and resentful, because we're suffering from that strange jealousy, like Rav Kook said, the jealousy of God, who is the only perfection. So a little bit of eitzot on how to move a little bit towards a happier life. Any comments?
This is also problem what the rest of us say. That also goes in the rest of the Hasidim thinking. Is that as long as you're down on yourself, you can't do good. Once you think, I'm a good person, I'm happy, then that's the first step to doing good.
Yeah. So I don't know much about that whole area of Hasidus, but I take your word for it, and it makes sense. Any other comments or questions before we close up shop?
You can relate this in some way to the Mussar movement, which seems to be a little different from what we hear now, and also the comments we read in the Gemara, all over the Gemara, I think we say them before Yom Kippur, relating to certain bodily emissions. There's no behavioral action, but it's really following the eyes that lead to something that the Gemara very Kabbalistically refers to in a very metaphysical, demonic way that we're supposed to really avoid.
Yeah.
So it's not just a challenge. It's,
yeah. So that's a really good issue. So this book, right? This Eitzot V'Hadrachot, this is a lot of it is meant for young men who are in yeshiva, who are suffering from a lot of depression and anxiety. A lot of this book is devoted to seminal emissions. I'm talking about adolescence. Most of us were adolescents at one time in our life. Things happen. In this world, when you learn those Gemaras, etc., and if you don't understand them properly, you just think when these things happen to you that you are the worst, horrible, most despicable human being. And from there's a spiraling down into constant anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, all kinds of terrible things happen. And I'm not going to tell you exactly what he says, but that's a theme that occurs a lot in this book. How to have a healthy attitude towards these things that you're not fully in control of. They happen. And with that interesting note, we will continue B'ezrat Hashem next week, hopefully talking about extraterrestrials. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
My pleasure. Bye.
See you next week. Nice to see you guys at Haberfields. Nice to see you.